Welcome to Developer Ramp Up, a channel dedicated to anybody who wishes to become a software developer or a better software developer. In this video we'll talk about authorization and Azure Active Directory. More precisely, we'll try to build a very simple console application that will send calls to the Microsoft Graph API and receive some basic information from it. Now, as you may know, you cannot just simply send calls to the Microsoft Graph API. In order to do that, you have to provide an authorization token in the header of the request. And this means that we will have to get our console application authorized to make these calls to the Microsoft Graph API. And to do that, we'll follow the OAuth 2.0 client credentials flow. And we'll try to get an access token from Azure Active Directory, providing a client ID and a client secret for our application. Then we will use that token when we send our call to the Microsoft Graph API. So that's the summary of what we will try to do right now. Let's then get started, and the very first step to do this would be to register our console application in Azure Active Directory. Because without registering it, you wouldn't be able to ask for an access token, and you also wouldn't have necessary details to ask for an access token like client ID and client secret. So let's do this right now. Registering your application in the Azure portal, so in Azure Active Directory, is an easy but important step, because without it you won't be able to request an access token to Azure Active Directory. So in order to do that, you have to log into your Azure portal, and to do that you need, of course, an Azure subscription. An MSDN subscription would just work, or if you subscribe for Visual Studio Community, you can also get access to a certain Azure subscription also with a certain amount of credit each month, and that would also work just fine. Or you can create your own Azure subscription, and this would also work. What I have to tell is that registering applications in Azure Active Directory, requesting tokens and so on, is not something that you would have to pay for. So this means that these features are really free, and even if you create your own Microsoft Azure subscription, you won't be billed anything for performing this tutorial. This being said, let's get forward. So if you are in your Azure portal, you would of course have to go to your Azure Active Directory, and there we have a blade which is called app registration, where we register our applications. Of course, we have to create a new application, and let's give it a name. Let's give it console Azure AD client credentials, and we have to choose a type. And this is a really important step, because you can choose here between web app or API and native. Now the first one is self-explanatory. It's mostly used for web apps and APIs. The second is usually for WPF applications or mobile applications or console applications like our one. However, you have to be aware that if you choose native, then the client credentials flow won't be available. So that's why we will go and choose web app or API, even if our application is a console application. It's not important exactly what type of application we have, but it's important when we choose here something to be aware of the options that we would have if we choose a certain type. And since we want to perform the client credentials flow, we will choose here web app or API, even if our application is a console application. Now for the sign-on URL, here you also have to provide a value. In case of a web app, this would be the URL to the page where you have your login form. Now for the console application, of course, we don't have a login form, and however we don't need login at all, since we will use the client credential flow, where we will provide only a client ID and client secret, so no username and no password. Now for the sign-in URL, it's useful that you put here your Azure Active Directory tenant name, like mine is this one, and afterwards let's call it console Azure AD, and let's also copy this one, because I think we might need it a little bit later. And then of course we have to click on create, and this will create our application. Now here you already see this application ID, which is exactly the client ID that we will need to provide. So make sure that you copy it and you put it somewhere safe, in a notepad file for instance, where you can use it later when you configure the console application. Now here we don't see the client secret so far. This means that we would have to perform some other configurations here. So first of all, let's go into properties, and where we see here that app ID URI, you get basically your domain name and a GUID. Let's replace this with the URL that we provided as a sign in page. So it is the name of my Azure Active Directory, and then it is console Azure AD. So this would be the way to do it, and of course we can afterwards. Anything else here is not something that you would need to configure right now. And here of course we have to click on save, and then this application will be saved in the settings that we have set. Now the next step here is to get the so-called client secret, and you can get this in the keys blade. And what you would have to do here is just add another key. Let's add test key. So you can provide a name that you want. It doesn't need to be something specific, and you have to choose if the key should expire in 1 year, 2 years, or never expires. Let's put 1 year here, and in value here you don't have to put anything. But the nice thing here, when you save it, you get this secret, which is the key, and please copy it and paste it also in a notepad, because you will need it further when we configure our console application. Note here that this is the only time that you will be able to see here the value of this client secret. So if we navigate away from this page and go then back to keys, we will see our text key, but we will never be able to see the value of the client secret anymore. So this is important that when you save it, you copy it and you put it somewhere to have it ready when you need to configure your application, because otherwise you won't be able to see it anymore. Of course you can at any point create another key and use it, but just be aware that when you save the key, that is the only time that you would able to see really your client secret. Now there is a final thing that we have to configure here, and we said in the summary that what we want to achieve with this console application is that we would be able to call the Microsoft Graph API and get some basic information from that Graph API. Now to do that, we have also to configure the permissions for it. And here we have first of all to add the Microsoft Graph API as an API that we want to send requests to. And after we added the Graph API, we also need some permissions here. And here, well, yeah, the permissions are very granular and for anything that you would have in your Active Directory. Right now, just to not stay long and check each item on the list and so on, just select all and then click select, and that's it. So you have selected all the needed permissions for this Microsoft Graph API, and this is now added. And the really last thing that you have to do is, as an admin, it's the best way to click grant permissions, and this means that basically the configuration for the access to the Microsoft Graph API is done. Now a thing to be aware of, these grant permissions is a very powerful thing, and for instance, if you develop some real world applications that are registered in Azure Active Directory and that also are used by your organizational users, basically what happens if you click on grant permissions is that your user won't see the screen anymore where they are asked to grant permissions to the application to access their user data. So if the application that you are registering is really a user-facing application, you shouldn't click on grant permissions unless you have really important reasons to do that, because it's best practice, and I think most of the data privacy regulation state that users should be aware of the applications that have access to their user data. So this means that if a certain user wants to use your application and when he tries to log in for the first time, the user needs to see the screen where the application states exactly what permissions are necessary. However, in our case, this is a console application. We will use the client credentials flow, so no username and no password, and therefore we can click on grant permissions. Otherwise, this wouldn't work as expected. And with this step, our application should be configured in Azure Active Directory, and purely theoretically, now we would be able to request an access token to Azure Active Directory and then use that access token to call the Microsoft Graph API that we have configured here. So let's get to the next step, and here we will switch to Visual Studio, and the next step would be, of course, to add some libraries that we would need in order to be able to work with access tokens and so on. Coming back to our console application, the next thing that we have to do in order to start working on this application is to add the necessary client libraries. Because all we need to talk to Azure Active Directory to receive a token and so on is not something that we can find in the standard libraries that we have in a console application. So we have to import a library, and since this is .NET Core, we will do this using NuGet packages. So we go to NuGet Package Manager and we will search for a client library that we need for this, and this is Microsoft Identity Models Clients Active Directory. And just install this library in your Visual Studio project. It would take a few seconds. It will install also some dependencies that this library needs, and just click on OK. And I accept for the terms and conditions for all these libraries that are needed, and with this the library is installed. And right now we can start writing our code. And let's take it step by step. The first thing we need to do is define some basic variables or constants that we would need to use when we construct our call to Azure Active Directory to get the access token. So let's import these constants and variables. We do this just above the static void main method because we want these constants and variables to be available throughout our console application. And what we see here is the basic way we declare constants in .NET. And we have a constant for client ID where we have pasted the client ID that we have copied when we registered the application in Azure Active Directory. Now for AAD instance, we have to provide the Azure Active Directory endpoint, which is login.microsoftonline.com. And of course we have here added a 0 because we will use it to construct the authority based also on the value that we have in tenant. And tenant is the Azure Active Directory tenant. This is a very important thing, and when you are in Azure Active Directory you can check your registered domains, and the domain which ends with onmicrosoft.com, which is also the default domain, is basically your Azure Active Directory tenant. Then we have to specify a resource. The resource is the Microsoft Graph API. So this means the API that we want to call afterwards. And then we have the app key, and the app key is nothing else than the client secret that we have copied when we registered our application in Azure Active Directory and created a key. This is the key that I have copied from there. And a last thing that we need here is a variable string of type string that is also static, and this will basically concatenate a string or format a new string based on AAD instance and tenant. And in order to be able to do this, we have also to import a new using statement system globalization, because culture info is not also part by default of this console application, but we have added it very easy. So that's all the strings and constants that we would need in order to be able to call Azure Active Directory for an access token. However, there are some other things that we would need throughout our application, like an HTTP client, like an authentication context, so let's add them. And we start with the HTTP client, which should also be private, static, HTTP client, and let's call it HTTP client, and this would be a new HTTP client. Okay, And we have here some typos, let's correct them. And last but not least, we have also to use system.net HTTP to the using statement. And here we have to add another T, and that's it. So now we have the HTTP client. What we also need is an authentication context. So it would be also private static authentication context. And for now, let's don't initialize it to anything, so let's have it null. And the authentication context, we have also to give, of course, a name to the variable. Let's give it context, and that should be fine right now. The authentication context is part of the Microsoft Identity Model Client's Active Directory library that we have imported previously. And one final thing that we would need here is a private static client credential. Let's call it credential, and let's also declare it null for now, because we will use these variables of type authentication context and of type client credentials a little bit later in our program to construct our queries to Azure Active Directory and to the Microsoft Graph API. But now let's get one step further, and let's design what we will have to write in the static void main method, which, as we know, is the entry point to our console application. The best way to start here would be to instantiate the context and client credential that we have defined previously, but we have set them to null. And these variables are of type authentication context and client credential. So let's do that. It would be context equals new authentication context, of course, and we will notice that if we try to instantiate the authentication context object like this, we have this red squiggly line under authentication context. And we see here also some information that authentication context does not contain a constructor that takes 0 arguments. And this is in fact true. If we look into the definition, we see that when we want to instantiate an authentication context, we have to provide a string that would represent the authority. Now, the good thing is that we already have created this authority, so we can just provide it as argument to this constructor. So just provide authority, and that would do it for now. Now, the next thing, we said that we want to do something similar for the credential. And this would be equal to new client credential, of course. And again, if we try to instantiate it like this with 0 arguments, we see that it's not possible. And in fact, we have to provide a client ID and a client secret. And we also have defined these constants, client ID and app key. So let's pass them as arguments to this constructor. So it would be client ID, okay, and app key. Okay, now we should be good to go for now. So right now we have an authentication context object and a new client credential object, which is kind of cool. Now the next thing, of course, we have to think about what we want our application to do. And the first step would be to call Azure Active Directory, present this client credential, and hope, of course, that we would receive an authorization token instead, a so-called authorization token or access token better. In order to do that, we would have to implement a certain method. The way we will do this in this application, we will use a task of string, which will be token and which will be equal to get token. And what we've done here, first of all, we have to use system threading tasks. And what happens here, or why did we use it like that? First of all, let's say we declare this token of type task of string and is equal to a certain method. The method is of course not implemented so far, so let's also generate a method. Now what this means is that this method will return a string, or better said, a task of string. And this task of string will be then assigned, of course, to token. And we can then also make get.wait in order to wait for this operation to complete. Why we choose to do it like that is we have to make an HTTP call to Azure Active Directory. And this is a really key scenario, or let's say 100% like scenario, to use async and await to do this asynchronously. Let's add here an async, and of course we will have right now some warnings because we do not have await. But the idea here is that we will wait until this method completes and it gets the token and it returns a task of string. What this means, it's basically that it will return something that if we use the result of it, we will see the exact access token. How we will do this exactly, we will define this in the get token method. But for now, I think it's okay. We have to think now about the next step that our application needs to perform, and this would be to make a call to the Microsoft Graph API and retrieve some user information. And we will also use a task of string here because what we will receive from the Graph API is JSON, and in this case we'll call it users, and it would be equal to get users. Of course, this method is also not implemented so far, but what we would need to do is to pass here a parameter to this method, which would be the result of the get token, so token.result. And this would be the access token that we receive from Azure Active Directory. And let's also implement this method here. And this is also a call that we make to an API, and therefore it's also suitable for async and await. And in fact, that's also how we will implement it. So it will be private static async, task of string get users and the result, and of course we'll have to await some operations somewhere in the methods. However, this is the basic skeleton of the application that we want to create. Of course, at a certain point we will add some console write lines that we display something to the console, but let's now start to build on this application skeleton that we have outlined so far. We'll start by implementing the getToken method first. And let's recap a little bit, what do we want to achieve within this method. So we want to call Azure Active Directory to authenticate this console application using the credentials flow, the client credentials flow, which means we will provide a client ID and an app key. We want then of course to receive an access token, and we want them to return this access token to the calling method. So let's start by getting rid of this throw not implemented exception, because we want to implement this method right now. And what we need here is first a result. So the result of the authentication that we perform to Azure Active Directory. And here I want to introduce a new class that we need to use, and this is authentication result. Authentication result. Okay, let's call it result, and let's make it null for now. And what we want to return from this method is of course a string. Let's call it token because it will contain the token, and let's also make it null. Now we can think about how we want to proceed right now. The good thing is all the information that we need in order to make this call is already here, and more using this identity models clients Active Directory library, we already have the methods that we need to make this call without the need to create a new HTTP client in this method. So what we will do is then just make result equals, and result is of type authentication result, as we can see here, and here we will use await, and we'll call the context, and here we have this acquired token async, and this is the method that we will want to use. Now let's look into the definition of this method. We see that we have a lot of overloads here, but we can also acquire this token just by providing a resource and a client ID. And that's exactly what we want to do. So the resource, we have specified it in the constants that we have defined just at the top of the application. Here's the resource, and we have to provide the client credential, which we have instantiated here, so we can just provide credential. And that's basically it. This will call Azure Active Directory and ask for a token, presenting of course the client credentials, which contain the client ID and client secret. Now our token will be then equal to result, and you see that in this authentication result class we have a property which is access token. So if we receive an access token, then it will be available through this property, and we can then set our token, our string token, to be equal this authentication result access token. And of course now we have just to return this token, as the return type of this method is of type string. And that's it. It's not a big deal. We have implemented it. Now let us try to test it a little bit. And what we want to do is a console write line here, and then token dot result. And the result of this task should be, of course, the string, the token string that we return here. And right now this should print our access token to the console. Now if we want to test this and run this application, it will show us the access token probably, but then it will hit this not implemented exception. So let's also make here string users equals null, and let's return null, just to make sure that we won't hit return users, sorry, just to make sure that we won't hit this exception and that we will be able to see the result displayed in our console. And if we run the application right now, we will see in a few seconds if we get a token, and indeed we got a token. And if you're familiar with JOT tokens, you see that this is clearly a JOT token. And we could also decode it and see exactly what claims it contains and so on, but this would be a little bit outside the scope of this short video. So what we have done so far is we have implemented this getToken method, which calls the acquire token async method on the authentication context object, and then the result, the authentication result, contains a property of access token that we can simply assign to our string that we then return to the calling method, which is this one. So our token that we have declared here will be equal to what we return from this method. Then we have to also make this token dot wait, because if we don't wait on the task here, what it will happen, it will continue to go through everything which comes afterwards before the getToken method being completed. So we will have here displayed something that is not correct, or we will hit an exception. So that's why we necessarily need to await the result of this task, which is of type string. Good, let's get now to the second step and try to implement a method to call the Microsoft Graph API and receive some basic information about users. Implementing the getUsers method will be a little bit more complicated, and that's because we have to call an API. And what we have to know about APIs is that each API has its own documentation on how we should construct and make the calls to that specific API in order to receive the expected answer. And if we go to check the Microsoft Graph API, we'll see, for instance, for these getUsers that there are some things that we have to take into consideration. And we would need to provide, for instance, also a query string which declares the API version that we want to target, and optionally if we want to specify a filter. But at least the query string is very important, so when we construct our HTTP GET method, we will have to make sure that we append this query string to our call. So if we go then back here, we would also need to declare a new variable which is also of type string, which is a query string, and let's instantiate it and give as value what we need. Sorry, hit the wrong button. And yeah, so API version equals 1.6. So this means that we will instruct our API, or we will declare to the Graph API that we want to target the version 1.6 of the API. Next, we need to think about the URI, which is nothing else than the URL, the endpoint to which we want to send our request. So we'll declare a new variable, this time of type var, and let's make it URI, and this would be equal to this value and plus the query string that we have defined earlier. And what this is, that's how we call the Microsoft Graph API. So it's https graph.windows.net, and then we have the name of the Azure Active Directory tenant to which I registered the application and from which I want to extract information about users. And then we specify the user's endpoint and a question mark, and afterwards we add the query string, and that's how we basically add the query string to the URL. Now the next step would be, of course, to think about the HTTP client. The HTTP client objects is something that we already have because we have declared it and instantiated it when we declared all the variables and constants that we needed for this program. And it is called HTTP client, so what we would need to do is use the already existing HTTP client. And if we do that, we see that we have here, for instance, default request headers. And that's what we want to use right now because we want to set the authorization header and to add the token that we have received previously to this authorization header. And in fact, in this default request headers, we see that we also have authorization. So this is what we want to add here. Now, how do we do this? It's simple. We instantiate it to new authentication header value, but we don't need all the system and everything around. So let's keep it out and let's instead use a using statement to it. And what we need to add here is, of course, the token, which we get here through this string. So we would be result, but the authentication schema says that we also need to add the word bearer before it. So we would do it like that. So this should normally construct the default header, the default authorization header, and its value should be bearer and then the token that we have passed into the method from the calling method here, getUsersToken.result. So that should do it. Since this is a very simple GET request to the Microsoft Graph API, I think we should have all the information we need for this GET request. So now we have to look into how do we send this request out. So let's first declare a new variable which would be result, and let's use the HTTP client. And here we'll say that we will see that we have getAsync, the getAsync method. And in fact, that's what we will use. And we will also await this, of course, and getAsync. Now, of course, we have to provide exactly what do we need to get. So we will provide the URI. And everything else should normally be already in the HTTP client default headers. We see, however, that we still have an error, and we use var result, and if we follow up with the error, we see that a local parameter named result cannot be declared because it already exists. And in fact, yes, it is correct. It exists because it is here and it is also here. So let's name this, sorry, not there. Let's name this get result instead of a simple result. And now I think we should be good for now. So this would then make a GET request to the specified URI using, of course, also the default authorization header that we have provided so far. So what we have to do right now is, well, to see what we have gotten as response as get result, and then assign this result, the body of this result, to the user's variable that we have declared locally. So let's use an if statement here to make sure that we won't get any errors and that our application would break. So if get result dot content, because the result we will get will have a content, of course, and this shouldn't be equal to null. So the result that we get shouldn't be equal null. In this case, what we want to do is users, because we want to assign something to users, and we will await and get result. And let's look a little bit what methods do we have here on the get result. And here we have, for instance, a method that we could use to get more information about the content. So first we choose content here, and what we see here is that we can read this content in different ways. So we can read it as a stream, as a byte array, but what we want to do is read it as a string because we want to return a string. So it's very simple. We will then await get result content and read as string. So this means that users will now be a string, which is correct because we declared it as type string, and then we return this method to the calling method. And normally, if everything is correct right now, we should have a JSON response that contains information about the users that are in this Azure Active Directory. Now, we can go back to our static void main method, and here where we have the get users, we also wait for it, and then also console.writeLine, and then here we will have users.result. And now theoretically, if there is no error in the application, we would be able to run it and to see exactly what information we would get. Let's first of all try to build this project to make sure that we don't have any errors in it. And seems that the build is completed successfully. And now let's run the console application once again. And we see that in some seconds we will first see the output of our access token, and then after a few seconds more we get a really huge output, which is the output from our API. However, let's do some fine-tuning to this, and where we add the token result, let's also add a line break so that it would be easier to follow up or to see exactly where a method finishes and where the other method starts. And to be consistent, let's also add this here. So also a line break, and let's run it again. And this time I think these two outputs should be separated by a line, and in fact that is correct. Now still there is some more fine-tuning that we could do here. For instance, we want to output to the console every time we perform an operation, what exactly do we perform. And probably it would be also nice to have this displayed in also using different colors. So what we can do here, we are here in the get users method, so this is when we will get the users. Let's first of all read console, and in console we can declare a foreground color, which is nothing else but the color of the letters that we will see in the console. And here we have an enum which is console color, and let's choose yellow. And let's now console write line. And what should we write to the console? Getting user information from graph API, and of course semicolon here at the end. And what we also need to do is console.reset color, because we want only this line to be written in yellow and everything else should be still white. Now once again we can copy and paste this also in the other method where we get the access token. And once again, I really don't encourage you to copy and paste code, but for demo purposes, I think it's much faster, and I think we could do that if it is possible. The only thing that we would have to change here is getting access token from Azure AD. Okay, and now if we run this program once again, I think our output would be also formatted in a more readable way. And yeah, that's correct. Now, another thing, or maybe a last thing that I want to discuss here in this video is the output that we received here. So normally this is a JSON. However, it's an OData file that we receive. And what I wanted initially to do is also to deserialize this JSON response that we get here so that we could see all the information in a more readable way. However, it's not that easy to deserialize responses that come from an OData document and that are formatted like that. If we would use a library like Newtonsoft to deserialize this, then the fact that we have a dot here would be a problem, and the deserialization will simply break. So if we would really want to deserialize this, we would need to create a real new object that would hold all the information as properties that we have here in the string. And this would take a fairly long amount of time, and I think it's not really the scope of this video, since here we wanted just to see how we can simply get an access token from Azure Active Directory and then call the Microsoft Graph API and get information about the user. However, we see here that the information that we get is some real information. We see that this user, for example, is enabled, and we see the enabled status for different services that are assigned to this user. We see the SKU ID and so on. So this is real user information that we get here. So that's it. Let's at the end make a short summary of what we have discussed. First of all, we have seen that we need to register our console application to Azure Active Directory so that we are able to make a call to Azure Active Directory and request an access token. And when we registered the application to Azure Active Directory, we did this as a web API or a web app, since we wanted to implement the client credentials flow. The client credentials OAuth flow is basically the flow where we provide a client ID and client secret, and we will get in return an access token if those details are correct. And this is exactly what happened also in our application. And after we have registered our application, we have defined some constants and different other variables that we would need. In this application, we have initialized the HTTP client. We have declared variables of type authentication context and client credential. And then we started to write, let's say, our logic here, and in a static void main, we first initialized the context object to a new authentication context and the credential to a new client credential object. And then we have created here two different methods, get token and get users. And of course, get token would then request the access token from Azure Active Directory, which we do here. And then the get users is the last step, the final step, where we simply call the Microsoft Graph API, providing the token that we received earlier, and in return we get a response containing real user information. So that's it for now. That's how we can very simply implement the client credentials flow in a simple console application using Azure Active Directory and the client credential flow. If you enjoyed this video and this channel in general, please hit the subscribe button. It would be very important for me. Also, if there are any things that you would like to share or questions that you would like to ask, feel free to drop a comment here. And if you know people that might be interested in this type of content, don't be shy and share this content on your social networks. Thank you very much for watching this video, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.